Hello, everyone, and welcome to this AHDB webinar. We're hosting it, AHDB, but it's in collaboration with Innovative Farmers and Pasture for Life. I'm Katie Evans, one of the Senior Engagement Managers at AHDB, and I'm really excited that you all took the time to join us this evening. So tonight we'll be discussing insights from the AHDB Economic Bale Grazing Report. That's part of a broader 4-year Innovative Farmers Field Lab project. In this field lab, we have 7 farmers from across Scotland and England that are actively exploring bale grazing for overwintering cattle. They're gathering data on soil and forage quality, as well as monitoring the economic impacts of this system change. These farms ranged in size and location, from Aberdeenshire all the way down to Oxfordshire, in both lowland and upland areas. But this really is helping to shed light on how bale grazing can work in a variety of UK farming systems. They also looked at different soil types, and this information can be found on the Innovative Farmers Field Lab webpage if you'd like to learn more about them. Before I start and hand over to our speaker, I just wanted to take you through some of our housekeeping notes. This webinar will last for 1 hour 15 minutes and it is being recorded. The recording will be circulated within the next 24 hours. We will hear from our speaker and there then will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. But if you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box at any time. We'll address as many as we can in the Q&A session at the end. If you encounter any technical difficulties, please use the chat function there again and we'll assist you how we can. But please keep an eye out on our AHDB website for some future events and webinars. We have a few events coming up in the next few weeks that look at outwintering systems, grazing systems, feed budgeting. So I'll flag a few of them at the end of this session, but they are open for registration already on our website. And then please do complete the feedback form at the end of this webinar with any additional questions or topics that you might be interested in. If we can demonstrate demand in a certain area, then we're happy to look at it and start putting a KE plan together and are putting webinars or podcasts or events together to help address some of those questions and areas that are of interest. Likewise, if you have any questions at the end of this, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us and we'll try to get your questions answered afterwards. Now, I'm thrilled to introduce our guest speaker, Emily Grant. Emily is an independent consultant and co-author of this report with Ridian Jones. Emily has extensive experience in the livestock management and sustainable agriculture. Both Emily and Ridian have been instrumental in interpreting this field lab financial data and collecting it and putting it together into something that's actionable insights for farmers. I also wanted to take a moment to thank the farmers that participated in this study. They generously shared their time, their data with us. And again, that's the quality of the report then we got back, was the information that they shared with us. And I'm sure we have a few of them joining us this evening. So I'm going to get started and hand over to Emily because it's not me that you're here to hear from. But thank you again for joining. Emily, would you like to take over from your presentation from here?
Can do. Thank you very much, Katie. I'll just get this screen up. And let me go into full play. Perfect. Katie, can you see the full presentation?
There we go. Yes, I can.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you for asking me to come and speak. So As Katie suggested, this is obviously part of a wider field lab with innovative farmers and Pasture for Life. And the aim of that wider field lab was to quantify the impact of bale grazing on forage quality, on forage quantity, and soil health post bale grazing. AHDB Beef and Lamb then commissioned myself and Ridian Jones to undertake an economic evaluation of the farms to compare bale grazing as an alternative to winter housing. So what I'll cover in my presentation is really on the economics. I'm not necessarily going to cover some of the soil stuff or soil health stuff or some of the practicalities of bale grazing. What we really want to do and what we did within the report was to really highlight where are the cost savings to be had and how can they be implemented more widely on different types of farms. So the why and the economics, or why using bale grazing to improve profitability on farms. So this came from work in Ireland, but I think that the data is pretty applicable to us here. And their work suggested that the suckler cow consumes over 80% and 50% of annual feed requirements in either the 80% refers to a calf to weaning system, or 50% of those annual feed requirements in a full calf to beef systems. So feeding the cow, particularly over the winter when we have little to no grass growth in most areas, is a major expense that's incurred in suckle calf production systems. So that's work that came from Ireland. So often when you're looking at farm businesses, it's a key area to kind of look into with suckler cows is how can we manage costs better within the system. And before we go into the bale grazing, I just want to first of all just focus a little bit on cost control and how we can manage costs within systems, because it's not always kind of straightforward or obvious. So cost control can really be either by reducing expenses, so that's quite obvious. If you can spend less, then obviously that's going to control your costs, but also by utilizing your existing resources, such as land or labor, more efficiently. Cost control also should never compromise profitability. The most effective cost control, and where everybody really wants to be, is to at least maintain output but with less input. So you still want the same output, but you want to be able to reduce those costs. This is a great quote from I probably, like many of you, listen to a few podcasts, but there's an Australian farmer called Nigel Cairn who is on various podcasts, but he always says you can't starve a profit into a business. And effectively what he means by that is, you can't necessarily cut all costs, and there are some costs that, actually help you deliver output. So it's really important just to be aware, that you're not going to compromise overall profitability if you are looking at controlling costs within your business. And really, the first step in any of these in looking and identifying, controlling your costs, is really you need to identify what your current costs are within your business. And then also easy to access benchmarking data, farm costings data that you can check yourself against, but then to focus on those costs that can be reduced or eliminated without compromising your strategic goals and or your performance. So makes sense, really. It's pretty logical, but it's not always an easy thing to do. Okay, I probably don't need to tell you this, but we'll just briefly cover over really what is bale grazing. So originating in North America, it's a grass and hay outwintering system. So there's deferred grass plus there's a provision of hay within a system that allows you to outwinter. So it's providing um, both hay and deferred grass within it. Also, it will be used, and all the farms within the survey were all using electric fencing to be able to allocate on a daily basis. As with any wintering system, the biggest cost of that system involves bringing food to the animals. So we think of traditionally housed systems, then it normally involves bringing often silage and perhaps other feed into the shed to be able to feed it. And also within that, if you've made silage, that silage is transported from the field to a store or into a pit, and then to be then put in front of animals, often on a twice-a-day basis. Allowing livestock to harvest in situ is always the lowest cost system for obvious reasons. So there's a little bit of work going on in New Zealand as well, looking at bale grazing as an alternative to winter forage crops, because outwintering is not new to us. Traditionally, we're probably more likely to see forage crops, which are often used as part of a reseeding program. But the work done in New Zealand compared bale grazing to a forage crop, and although they found that the forage crop was effectively cheaper to establish, the big difference in costing of that forage crop was actually the period of time it takes you up once you've finished the forage crop to then re-establish back into grass. That's what makes bale grazing a reasonably effective tool. And also, though, they found that you probably need about 50% greater area than you would for a forage crop. So if you think about how much yield you can gain off a forage crop, it's always going to be slightly more than what you can grow within your deferred grass, and then feasibly have within bales. But that just helps you start to have a bit of a feel for, if you want to implement bale grazing, how can it work? How does it compare to other systems? Okay, so the farms involved, as Katie said, there were 7 farms involved. They were between Aberdeenshire in the north, that were the furthest north, Oxfordshire was further south, and Penrith would be the wettest part of the country. Farm size, huge variation in farm sizes. So 44 hectares was the smallest, 1,141 hectares was the largest. Again, big variation in herd sizes, so 14 breeding females versus 217 in the largest. Calf sales, there was a mix of store producers, there was a mix of people who only produce fat, and actually a lot of the units also were selling both. 4 of the participants were also selling direct to consumers. So the number of days that participants were spending on bale grazing also varied. 34 days was the shortest period spent bale grazing, up to 180 days. It was pretty much a full winter on bale grazing. The shut-off date for deferring the grass varied from 1st of March to the 1st of August. And all but one of the farms had also been going under major structural changes, with 4 of the 7 farms still building cow numbers. And one of the farms hadn't actually ever housed before. They'd always had an outwintering system. So some of those structural changes were changes in breed, changes in species. So one unit had previously had sheep, which was now a deer enterprise, going organic, and as I said, building stock numbers. So this variation within business or structural changes actually made doing cost benefit analysis quite tricky, because to do a successful cost benefit analysis, the ideal is to have a really good before and after costings. And okay, we always get cost changes within seasons, but it certainly made it a lot more tricky. So this also explains partly why the report's laid out how it is. And on interviewing all the participants, we were able to draw out relevant data that really helps give you a feel for what the cost savings can be. And also, everybody starts from a different starting point, different types of housing systems, different types of cattle, different stock numbers, different mob sizes, etc. So as the starting point, what are the potential benefits to the business of bale grazing? These won't be a surprise to you. So the potential benefits are a reduction in fuel use. As I said, it's about taking the stock to the feed rather than taking the feed into the stock. And again, similarly, a reduction in labour time requirements over winter. And also quite relevant this year because straw has been a lot more expensive, but a reduction in straw usage, obviously because they're not housed for the period of bale grazing. Other potential benefits are increase in pasture fertility. So we haven't really looked at that because that's ongoing work, but we can still give rough costings of what the the benefit in terms of NP and K of hay bales are. Wider than just the costs, actually increases in personal well-being, and we'll cover this towards the end, but also all the participants said they actually enjoy bale grazing, even if the weather can sometimes be a little bit adverse. They actually really enjoy dealing with stock outside, and also increase in biodiversity. And again, that doesn't necessarily have a financial cost against it, but it's things like this which will also be covered in the wider Innovative Farmers report. So those are the potential benefits. What are the potential costs to the business? Obviously, making any change to a system, although it can bring the benefits, also we need to make sure we're considering all the impacts of a change in the system. So there's a potential reduction in the summer and autumn grazing area, obviously because you're deferring grass. There's also potential a reduction in stock numbers or output. So obviously depends on what your starting point is, and many people house or have stock numbers that suit a summer, I suppose spring all the way through to autumn stocking density. So if you're also needing to have land that is providing food over the winter, then that may lead to a slight change in stocking numbers. Again, if you're using it for outwintering young stock, potentially reduce growth rates in young stock. Also potentially a reduction in pasture fertility in terms of the areas that you are exporting hay from. So in some house systems, there may be traditionally cut silage areas, which are then made for feeding silage and housed, and that manure that then comes out of the house will go back to the fields that have been used to make silage. So it's just something to be aware of, particularly if you're exporting fertility, i.e. a hay crop from one field onto a different part of the farm. It's just making sure there's account taken of any P and K that's getting removed and shifted to a different part of the farm. Now that may also be intentional. You can use it as a way of shifting nutrients and improving nutrients on a poorer area of the farm. Other potential costs, stranded costs, and what this really means is if, for example, and obviously all the participants did still have sheds, that actually if you're no longer using that shed, it can effectively, it almost has a degree of redundancy that actually it becomes a stranded cost because you still can't get rid of that cost within your fixed costs. Most of the participants did actually house for some of, and particularly it was more common to house pre-calving, but have most of the winter outside. And then a potential cost, bale wastage. And I know some people don't necessarily like use of the term wastage, but there is a degree of loss of bales to weathering. And effectively, we still need to see that as a cost to the business, even though there's a slight benefit in terms of what it can do to the soils. But we'll come on to that later. Okay, so from our discussions with all the farmers and pulling together all the data, where are the key cost saving areas? Okay, so labour was first on our list. So the time varied for all of the farms. The time varied from half an hour to 2 hours per day to undertake their bale grazing. Mostly that is about shifting fences and unrolling bales of hay for the livestock. It's obviously highly dependent on the number of mobs you have. So one farm, maybe two farms actually only had one mob of cattle. So it was all ages mixed in together. And another farm was running three different mobs of either cows, two mobs of mixed age cows, plus one mob of heifers. And it also depends on your location of the bale grazing area. So if it's a distance from farm, that can add in a bit of a time. So between all the farms involved, the average reduction in time of bale grazing versus housing there was a halving time of 51% reduction in time. The maximum was a 75% reduction in time, the minimum only being 33%. So it's highly location dependent and also dependent on how many mobs you have. But that will give you an indication of what the labour savings are. Also, in terms of labour, all the participants in the project, they all set out their bales ahead of winter. Usually that was undertaken immediately after making the hay to avoid a second handling. And Actually, I should also say that 2 of the participants also bought in hay because they were looking to improve species rich. So they bought in specific species rich hay to drop seed into these areas. So time spent putting out the bales, and yeah, it kind of varied. We've got in the first column here the number of bales put out. On average, across all the farms was 100 bales. The maximum was 800 bales put out. That's on quite a large system, and the minimum was 36 bales. When we worked out how long it took them to do, there was actually quite a variation in the number of bales that people were putting out per hour. So the average was to lay out 14.4 bales an hour. The maximum was 26. But the minimum was 8.8. And when kind of delved a little bit deeper into that data, the difference between the minimum and maximum really depended on how many bales per hectare were going out. So that one that was taking a little bit longer to put out the bales, there was quite a decent number of bales going out. So there's probably a reasonable bit of haulage depending on how far they were traveling. And also, it was commented by one of the participants that actually having hydraulic trailers is really is a way to avoid having to strap bales on. So there was savings in time for that as well. Okay, so that was labour. This is fuel, which is the next one that most people think of as a cost saving when bale grazing. So we actually had really good data from one farm on a before and after a housed and then an out winter session, and we could do that by using fuel use per day in terms of litre. So we can draw out, we can ignore the cost differences that you have year on year within that. So this was for this farm C has 140 head of sucklers. And actually the big saving was actually in the change of machine and the degree of mechanisation. So historically, when housed, they were using a mixer wagon, and now they're out wintering. It's a UTV with a bale and roller. So quite a significant change in how we do it. But we've looked through the data here. So the first column is housed, and they were using 40 litres a day on the mixer wagon and loader tractors, etc. And if we put in a current cost from that, that would be £32 per day. When we look at the outwintered, yes, there's some fuel use on that setting out the bales, but the fuel use per day in running up and down to the bale grazing area to be able to shift fence and to unroll bales is quite a significant saving. So that we can see in the bottom of that right hand column there that they had a 72% reduction in the daily fuel cost. One of the other farms with a slightly higher number of head as well also had about 68% reduction in their daily fuel cost as well. So that's a decent saving, but most of that comes from using different bits of kit. Okay, so resource use. So we're going to start to focus now really just how people are using the areas that they bale graze. So as I mentioned before, obviously not housing then requires additional area of land to be utilised over the winter, and just how that fits into the system. So the time spent bale grazing varied from 34 to 170 days. So there is quite a range within that. The start and the end dates that people were bale grazing for depended on a variety of factors, such as available pasture, weaning, and or calving date. So if we look in that first column, we can see that the bale grazing area shut-off date. So when do people start to defer the grazing? So on average, the date was 15th of July, so middle of summer. The earliest was 1st of March, and the latest was 11th of August. Now, this will be slightly dependent on the type of land you have. So all those involved in the project were either on kind of permanent pasture or, yeah, sort of longer term tight pastures or even into some rough grazing. Although one of the participants did trial for the first year, running some heifers with herbal lay silage on an Italian ryegrass on an arable, a field that's in an arable rotation. But generally, we're seeing this operating on permanent pasture type fields. So the amount of pasture, the amount of time that you need to defer grass for will vary with the pasture production potential. So the date of the start of bale grazing, so that varied as well. So on average, people started on the 4th of December. The earliest was the 1st of November. and the latest date was 28th of February. So some people were also using just deferred grazing through the start of the winter, and just in that last part of the winter were switching on to bale grazing, and others were just starting bale grazing pretty much at the start of their winter period. Date of the end of bale grazing, so a bit of variation in that as well. So on average, that was about 12th of April. Earliest was 21st of February, and the latest was 30th of May. So often this coincided with calving, or also with housing pre-calving. Some were housing about a month before calving within there. Also dependent on just what the pasture availability was. So the date to the first regraze after bale grazing ranged from the 21st of April. So that would be the one who had ended their bale grazing on the 21st of February. So they were back in by the 21st of April to the 26th of July. So again, quite a variation within that. So I'm hoping this kind of image will actually show how people were using their bale grazing area. So we've got 4 farms here, comparing them all. So also just the different colours. So the bright green is the period of time that they actually grazed with stock, normally at some stage during the summer. The slightly darker green is the period that the field where the bale grazing was deferred. And then that more yellowy green colour is the period that they were actually bale grazing for, and the numbers. And then the orange period, the orange marking is where they actually had a rest period. So we can see there's a little bit of difference, particularly probably Farm A actually is they have, and for them compared to housing, they have this rest period after bale grazing from February all the way through to May. So if you think under their traditional system when they were housing, they would actually probably be in turnout at some stage during March within that. So that will sit in as a cost to their business, that rest period within that. But what I would say, they're probably the earliest finish their bale grazing, but actually they're getting back on to graze in that late April, May, June period. So this is a period when there's really a fast and high grass growth rate. So they're actually utilising that growth rate and that rest period reasonably well. To remember, talking about maintaining output, they can actually put ewes and lambs on at that period. And then they have a cut-off point, that farm A have that cut-off point of early July. And then they're setting out their bales in kind of late September. So similarly, we can see, and there's real range in the deferred period and how long pastures are deferred for, and then how much time is actually spent bale grazing. So farm B actually has quite a long deferred period, but then a small period of time actually spent bale grazing. And yeah, it really varies, but setting out bales was at reasonably similar time. And you can see from most of the farms, actually, the rest period is pretty similar. So I think the best way to think about this is actually, and in terms of costs, is that period where the fields are deferred is almost like leaving a standing hay crop. So they're not going into harvest again. So I suppose if you look back at Farm A, if they were to have taken a second hay or silage crop of that, they would have had a bit of aftermath grazing. So there's a slight loss to the business there as well of not having an aftermath grazing. So it's really important just to make sure that, yeah, the benefits of doing this, of having that slight loss of pasture utilization or pasture production is really offsetting those costs of housing over winter. Okay, so how did the diet mix and diet quality look? So within the project, some of the farms, not all of them, had analysis of both their hay and their deferred grass. So we can see here that deferred grass has an average ME for all those tested was an average ME of 9.1 kilogram per dry matter and an average percentage crude protein of 13.2. And in terms of the average hay quality was an ME of 8 and a crude protein of 10.5. So the deferred grass is obviously sitting at slightly higher quality, and particularly in both protein and in ME. However, if we look at the low value in hay, then the low values really are quite low, 7.1 and 7.6 of ME and crude protein. Recommendations for suckler cow maintenance is a minimum of 9 megajoules of ME and 9% crude protein. So you can see the value here in the amount of deferred grass that's offered. So the deferred grass can just help effectively bring that hay up to a better balanced diet for the cattle. I think it's always interesting just to see the quality difference, that the deferred grass is still maintaining quality better than if you'd made hay. However, when we look at this in terms of recommended energy levels for growing stock and of finishing stock, then deferred grass isn't providing sufficient energy in terms of ME, although it's not far off in terms of providing the crude protein. But definitely, once you've included the hay within there, then yeah, it's not an ideal ration here, looking at the data we have from these farms for growing stock. But as I'd mentioned, one of the farms involved did trial last year using Italian ryegrass plus herbal ley silage as a way to effectively bale graze some heifers. So that kind of system maybe has potential to provide high quality forage through both the deferred and the silage to be able to support growing stock. So the proportion of hay and deferred grass in the diet, I mean, many would probably say that their aim was roughly 50-50, but when we looked at on a dry matter basis, and I will say that there's a slight caveat with these figures, is that we make assumptions of pasture entry and pasture exit heights because we didn't actually always have that. But we also double checked what we think stock were getting fed based with providing, did the diet provide sufficient ME, and it did. So on average, on a dry matter basis, stock were getting 58% deferred grass and 42% hay. When we looked at it on an ME basis, and again, this is just indicating that the deferred grass is providing the slightly higher quality diet, is that on the ME basis, deferred grass is providing 60% of that ME, the hay 40%. So it looks like for suckler cows, it's a pretty good diet, and that hopefully gives you an indication of roughly where to be aiming at. We also, within the report, I've not brought it up here, but you can see we have a bit of discussion within the report about body condition score as well, and how some of the participants didn't really see any change in body condition score, whereas others had a specific loss. You know, it was almost like a name for a loss. But we often see that in house systems anyway, that there will be a planned reduction in body condition score within house systems. And although we can, and within the report, we can give a little bit of an indication of the cost of reduction in body condition score, because it can happen in either system. We haven't necessarily included it in the cost benefit analysis. Okay. So bale wastage, as I mentioned, I think people, we don't always want to see or describe it necessarily as bale wastage, but there is a degree of loss of bales, and particularly, you know, as I alluded to, a lot of the bales were out by August or into September, and then some of the time when bale grazing started could leave bales out potentially in some wet weather for a significant period of time. However, I think everybody that we spoke to was pretty satisfied, and were happy with what they felt was the degree of bale wastage, which on average came out at about 10.7%. So the minimum that participants felt was just a 5% wastage with a maximum at 25%. So, but I will add that the one who had the maximum at 25% had a specific aim of wanting to improve soil health, so specifically leaving some of that bales to break down within the soil rather than to be going through the animal. We also got an indication of bale costs and the difference between making hay on the farm or the difference between purchasing hay. So on average, the costs, and it really varied. Some people using contractors completely for the job, and others were using a mix of their own machinery and equipment and contractors, often contractors to do the baling. So the bale cost on average for hay, and we were collecting this data in December 23, so this will be from summer 23 mostly. It was £11.90, maximum cost £13, minimum cost £8. So you can see with that cost, that a 10% wastage, we need to factor that in. Obviously, if you're buying in hay, and I'll reiterate that this was specifically species rich hay as well, but those were the cost differences as well between buying in hay. So again, if you have a bit of bale loss, that still needs to be factored in as a cost. Also worth noting that a tonne of hay on a fresh weight basis contains on average about 14.9 kilos of nitrogen, 5.9 kilos of P, and 17.9 kilos of K. So there's some decent amount of nutrient within a tonne of feed, and most livestock will excrete, most of those nutrients either through urine or through dung. So it'll vary according to the NPK, but it'll be roughly about 80%, if not 90%. So, but it's worth just being mindful of these numbers and figures in terms of the amount of hay that is in a bale grazing area. And also making sure that you don't end up with nutrient hotspots. So ways to avoid nutrient hotspots are obviously unrolling, and all the participants unrolled their bales. Also, it gives stock better access to the hay as you go through as well. But that can help avoid those nutrient hotspots, and also try and avoid bale grazing in the same areas year on year, because otherwise you are likely to start to build up or potentially lose, particularly potassium and nitrogen are pretty mobile if you're in pretty wet conditions and you have free draining soils. So it's just something to be aware of. But one of the farmers who probably had a slightly higher, it was more kind of 60% bales to 40% deferred grass, their equivalent per hectare was 80 kilos of nitrogen, 32 kilos of P, and 98 kilos of K. So that's a decent amount of nutrient equivalent. And okay, the livestock will be taking a little bit of that off, but that's a decent amount of nutrient that bales can bring in. And as I alluded to earlier, it's also worth considering where you're taking that hay from on the farm, where else, and making sure that that P and K in particular is being replaced. And particularly if you've always traditionally spread your farmyard manure on the areas that you've made silage from. Okay. So amelioration. And by that I mean, do you need to fix any areas after having bale grazed? So none of the farms really reported any significant poaching damage. I do put the caveat there of that data is collected in December 23. So if we'd asked that question after last winter, although to be fair, even in December, it's still been quite wet in places. But as ever, poaching is always a function of the amount of time that animals spend in an area rather than necessarily stocking density and things. So daily shifts always have stock moving on to areas where there's a fresh bite and the fresh bale. Only one of the participants used a back fence, and that was just a weekly back fence. Most of them didn't back fence at all. You don't really need to overwinter when you don't have regrowth, and not back fencing allowed stock to have access to water, and it saves time as well if you're not having to wind up or shift in back fences as well. So as I said, though, none of them reported significant poaching damage. None of the participants had issues where they'd been rejected or waste hay remained, even the one that had slightly higher wastage. So there wasn't perceived to be any tidying up or clearing up needed, that eventually, if there was a little bit of unutilized hay, that it did disappear reasonably quickly. And other than potentially rolling or hand sowing some senior on any really bare areas, all the participants were happy with their pasture recovery. And I suppose that possibly also reflects on the recovery time that people are giving in places as well. But I think it's important to highlight that there's a perceived issue with outwintering during wet winters, but if it's well managed, it maybe can be less of a problem than it's perceived to be. Oh, I should say actually within that, soil type really varied. So some people were on clay, some were on sandy loam, and some were on sandy loam. So there's a real variation within that. But I'm sure, as you're aware of, the wider Innovative Farmers project is looking at the soil health. So hopefully that will cover off once all the data's in for that. Okay, cost benefit. Most of the reason why you're here. So hopefully that's given a bit of an overview of where those cost savings can come from. So reduction in labour, reduction or more effective use of labour, or reduction in fuel use, etc. And also it provides a pretty decent diet. Okay, so just briefly before we'll go through, we did a cost benefit analysis for one of the farms, but we'll just highlight just really how cost benefit analysis works. So it's a really useful way to interrogate the benefits and implications of making a change to part of an existing enterprise. So when I said earlier, it's really great to have a before and after. So to go from a house system to a bale graze system where we have some good data to understand what the costs were, labour input, fuel input were into the house system, and then to be able to compare that within a bale graze system. Caveat, as ever, whilst it's useful, it's not entirely perfect. It's really easy to allocate variable costs. So, for example, most people will be able to tell you pretty easily how many bales of straw they use for bedding each week or each day equivalent, and how much silage they're giving. But once you get into fixed costs, that can get a little bit harder. So the fixed costs might be things like, insurance and or even some of your machinery repairs and maintenance to machinery and things as well. So they can be a little bit trickier. It also sometimes requires us to make assumptions where there's uncertainty or incomplete data. So we're just saying it's not perfect, but it's still better than nothing. Also, it's really important to say that it may not completely capture all the relevant costs, benefits, or outcomes. And it also doesn't really test the feasibility, i.e., what we really mean by that is, although we can have a positive or negative cost benefit analysis, it's not really looking at what implications does that have on cash flow, on available capital, or on risk. So it really is just a little snapshot of the economics, and making sure that it if you're considering doing it, that actually this looks like a viable option financially. And really important as well that the cost benefit adopting bale grazing will be unique to each farm. It entirely depends on your costs at the moment, the kind of housing system, because you could be cubicle sheds, you could be slatted sheds, you could also just be straw courts, and also what type of land you have to be able to bale graze on, how long you think you can bale graze for, etc. But this report, we hope, and the data that's in it will help you identify where those cost savings can be made. Okay, so Farm A. Farm A has 220 head of April calving suckler cows. Traditionally, they were housed in straw courts from the end of October through to calving in April. Some arable on the farm as well, so you were utilising homegrown and also some purchased straw to make up shortfall. Diet for those cows when they're housed was 14 kilos of silage, 4 kilos of straw, 1.5 kilos of pot-ale syrup, and that was all put through a mixer wagon. The farm now bale grazes 3 mobs of approximately 70 head on a 9 to 10 hectare area with 180 bales for 63 days. Shut-off date is early July, so that's the period when the pasture gets deferred. The aim is for roughly a 50-50 grass, that shouldn't say silage, should really say hay, grass to hay diet. The time spent now is 30 minutes per mob to move the fence and unroll bales. So they have 3 mobs, as I said, there's 3 times 70, so that's an hour and a half spent on bale grazing for that number of cows. They're also giving a daily allocation with no back fence. So within this farm, as well, as we alluded to earlier, in terms of having to make adjustments to the system, there has been a small reduction in the number of ewes because there's just slightly less grass available in the spring, and also slightly less pasture available in the autumn. But that needs to be accounted for. And these are, I think we often see headline figures of big cost savings on farms that are starting to change their systems, or, for example, to undertake bale grazing or deferred grazing and things. But it's really important to remember that the wider implications of that are accounted for, because it's not just about the headline figure of savings of 30 or 40,000. If there's an impact elsewhere in the business, that needs to be accounted for in the cost benefit. So we'll just come up through. So apologies, yeah, we're dealing with finances. It's I can't unfortunately have a nice pretty picture. It's going to be numbers and figures up here. So if we look on the left hand side, these are the reduced costs from the housing system. So the key costs in there with the silage, remember we said 14 kilos a head, and we've allocated a dry matter cost to that silage. So it was costing £16,464. Plus some of the straw. There was straw within the diet, so there was feeding straw, plus there was bedding straw. So we've pretty good data on that the number of bales that were going through the system. Also, we had good data on the amount of time that was spent, and that was for employee staff as well. So we knew the hourly rate going through there. Plus, remember we said there was some pot ale syrup within the diet, so we can now remove that out of the costs. And we had a reasonably good handle on the fuel use under the house system as well. And the thing we probably haven't touched on yet is things like muck spreading. So that's obviously a cost within if you're having to muck out sheds and then spread the muck, whereas obviously in the bale grazing system, that's all happening in situ. So when we add all those figures together, we can see that the cost savings were £31,672. So on a per head per day basis, that was coming out at £3.23. So when you're doing cost benefit, it's really important to then consider any additional income due to the change. So in this case, there's none because it's still the same number of cows. We're just running a slightly different wintering system. So the net benefit per head per day was £3.23. Okay, if we shift over to the bale graze side, so in the next column, so the additional cost due to the change, so setting out bales, it didn't take a huge amount of time to do that. Making hay, so when in the first column we're not making silage anymore, but we need to account for now actually making hay. So there's significant cost savings in making hay. But there is that little bit of bale wastage in there. So we've got 10% bale wastage, which was perceived to be about right by the farmer involved. And then we also then have the labour change. So the daily moves, as I said, was half an hour per head per day at £17 an hour. And again, the difference in the fuel use. So when we add all that together, the total cost increase of undertaking bale grazing was £3,215. We work that out on a per head per day, that's 73 pence. However, as I said, it's the income forgone, it's these slight changes to the system that can start to have an impact. So it wasn't a huge number of ewes that are now kind of out of that system, but it was 8 ewes per hectare over the 9 hectares. And at a gross margin for forage cost of £50 a head, that's £3,600. And again, one of the really important things about straw, although straw is really expensive, actually it has been a source of P&K within the system, and when you work it out per bale, it's worth about £3 per bale in terms of P&K. So there's a loss of fertility for not having bought in the straw. Okay, so that's where we get that total income forgone figure of £4,000. And if we work that out per head per day, then we can see that that there's a net cost of £1.65. So comparing the two, the £3.23 benefit, the £1.65 cost, then we can see that there's a total benefit to the business of £1.58 per head per day when those cows are being bale grazed versus being housed. So that gives us a rough halving of those costs. It's important to say as well, actually, this farm didn't bale graze for the whole of the winter. So the first half of the winter, they're actually just on deferred grass. So there's even greater cost savings in their wider business, because obviously there's no hay cost. It's just shifting an electric wire. Okay. So what were the main cost savings? Yeah, as we said, £3.23. So the big cost savings were not making silage. So that was a £1.68. The reduction in straw use, 95. Now, everyone's known how much straw has increased in value, so that may be a slight underestimation for this year just past. Reduced labour, 21 pence, no pot ale syrup, 20 pence, less fuel, 13 pence, reduced muck spreading. So these were the biggest cost savings. The main costs incurred was the income forgone from the reduction in use. So that's why it's important to have these in. And yeah, there's a cost with making hay, labour, the loss of the P&K from the purchased straw, bale wastage, fuel, setting out the bales. So those are the key differences. But I think, and this is true not only for this farm, but even looking at some of the other farms as well, the biggest savings were actually switching from silage to hay and also not buying in straw. So they had become the biggest cost savings within those farm systems. And then falling down below that will be labour. Okay. So I mentioned at the start as well, there are some wider benefits. So these are kind of benefits that we can't really put a financial value on. But these are some of the quotes that we got from the farmers involved. So much happier being outside rather than in the yard, having more family time. Also, if things go wrong in the shed, it's harder to fix than a broken wire. And also that it felt shifting out of housing into bale grazing felt more like a 9 to 5 job, and that weekends are now weekends. Time is a big saving compared to housing. There feels to be less monotony in winter and much less time spent carting straw and mucking out. And then also from a biodiversity benefit, again, we can't really put these, we don't really have values on these, but this is what participants had noted, was that there were more insects, noticing more birds. Definitely, pretty almost consistently, everyone noted a lot more voles from the deferred grazing. Some people had started to see different plant species where they'd imported species-rich bales, pasture looking more lush and abundant. One quote was about financially making cattle more sustainable and taking the pressure off everything else within the system. And also there, compared to housing, cattle are much cleaner and healthier. And also cows being fitter at calving. So those ones in bold are the most common comments that we got back. Okay, so in summary, so the cost and benefit will be unique to each farm as they will to your farm. And also what is unique is the resources that are currently used and the resources that you have available. So our analysis show that half of the cost per head per day of I'll start again. Analysis show that we could halve the cost of per head per day of bale grazing versus housing. And it's really important to make sure that the saving isn't outweighed by other costs to within the system, i.e. it's really important to make sure that that income forgone is accounted for, however that looks. But more importantly, actually, and this is one of the hardest things, it's really hard to reduce your fixed costs. So one of the farms did actually sell a mixer wagon. So that's a really great way to start to get rid of some of the fixed costs. So that will bring in some capital, but also you don't have the repairs and maintenance, you don't have the insurance costs on that, just the general kind of wear and tear. But it's a really hard thing to do. And particularly a lot of some of the participants certainly still did house for a period of time or still did house some young stock. So the shed doesn't really go away. But if you can reduce fixed costs, so for example, by selling kit or equipment, this is where the biggest profit benefits can lie. So we can see the difference in the variable costs, like not buying straw or the reduced cost in making hay rather than making silage. But one of the participants also had an alternative use for the shed. So the shed's no longer used for housing at all. It has an alternative diversified enterprise in it. Or finally, the best way to reduce fixed costs is actually, or not necessarily, but one of the ways to reduce fixed costs is actually to increase your output, to be able to spread your fixed costs across the business. So that's why I alluded to earlier, it's really important that if you do make decisions about cost control, that ideally you're not really hitting output. You want to reduce the cost, but still try and maintain output. Challenging to do, but it is possible. Okay, Katie, that is me, and I've gone slightly over. Oh, Katie, you're on mute. I'm just going to stop sharing.
Sorry, Emily. Thank you.
I had to
Um,
panic.
no, no, no. No, I was just saying that if we haven't any questions in yet, but if anybody does have questions for Emily, questions about the report, how you could maybe take that template and fill in your own figures. And that's a really important exercise, I suppose, for farmers to do when they're looking at system changes. And also, I suppose it's a good place to start in looking at some of those figures and how this would fit into to your farm system. Just keep an eye on it there. So please submit while we can and while we can get them answered. Um, Emily, that was fantastic, and it's really interesting. We have a few questions coming in now. We have one in on thoughts on bale grazing with sheep. Is that something you've come across with some of these farmers or other farmers?
Yeah, I think I know of one or two people who do bale graze with sheep. I think the challenge is just making sure uh, sheep probably aren't quite as good at tidying up as others and tend to use bales as if for example you're unrolling, tend to utilize them for lying on rather than actually eating. So it is a challenge with sheep. Some people do use ring feeders and silage, and also a lot of sheep producers tend to want to feed silage rather than just hay. um so it, it yeah, it's more challenging. I think probably works best for sheep is actually just deferred grazing, all grass wintering. Because as you could see from the report, the quality of the pasture, even though it's been deferred, actually isn't too bad compared to the hay. So for ewes, that's probably a slightly better feed. But yeah, I do know one or two people who do try it with reasonable degree of success. But you tend to then need the ring feeders and things, and that just starts to bring in a whole lot more complication compared to the nice ideal of having cows with a single wire and being able to unroll bales that they generally tidy up pretty well. Is that a damning indictment on sheep?
No comment. Um, Someone's asked here about, and I know it's not something that we have at hand, but the performance data behind these livestock groups. Do you just
Yeah.
want to give an overview of the kind of data that was shared with you and Ridian when doing this?
And is that referring to like capital growth rates or
Yes, stock
yeah.
performance,
So
differences
yeah,
across the.
yeah. So I mean, generally, and bale grazing is probably is best suited for suckler cows, as you can see from that diet quality. So, and generally, most people like to go into the winter. So if you are out wintering, you need to be providing a little bit more forage availability. There'll probably be a 10 to 20% re- increase intake from being outside of a winter just to deal with cold and wet conditions. So you do need to providing a little bit more. But with the right type of cow, people generally are reporting that they have a planned body condition score reduction anyway. They're going to go in a little bit. They want their cows going into winter a little bit fatter. So that's part of the policy anyway. We didn't really get any hard weight data on calves. So some people still ran calves with their cows. So they were still suckling, they hadn't been weaned. But to be honest, when we looked at the data for that, even if the cows were still providing a small amount of milk, it's probably making the diet suitable for those calves that were still suckling. The the challenge is probably in some of the cattle that have been weaned. So some people were running real mixed age cattle all as a one mob. One of the participants had estimated that their calves were probably growing at zero point 0.3 of a kilo per head per day over that period of bale grazing. Um, but yeah, we unfortunately didn't really have any hard data for that. But I suppose I'm hoping that the diet, giving that diet data, gives an indication of what's possible. And I think, yeah, without really higher quality, and actually it's probably really interesting because in the States and Canada where this comes from, they will provide alfalfa hay as well as grass hay. Um, Now they're very lucky that they can be able to make alfalfa into hay because
Yeah,
it's going to be really hard, so hard to do here. But actually, they're providing quite a nice diet with a mix
yeah,
of alfalfa and grass hay. So
and
that's a
that's
key
one of the
difference.
comments.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the comments here is that the huge challenge around trying to making hay in certain regions.
Yes.
It's a challenge in itself. Um, Someone's asked as well and put forward of insights on cold weather and water supplies. I know that's the water supply side is
Yeah.
something we touched on before the webinar started. Um, but there again, Emily, do you want to just pick up the different systems that the
Yeah.
farmers with infrastructure that they had available to them?
Yeah. So a mix of opportunity and we didn't the costs of watering systems didn't really appear because all the participants were already rotationally grazing anyway. So they were rotationally grazing or mob grazing during the summer. So they actually all pretty well had water infrastructure in place to allow them to do that year round. What they did say was though, and I kind of mentioned that they wouldn't always back fence in the wintertime. Um, so that because your pasture's not growing anyway, but it specifically to allow access back to maybe a fixed trough or a trough that had reasonable reliability of not becoming frozen. It is a challenge, and or also to give access or specifically choose bale grazing areas where they can get direct access into a watercourse that's obviously always flowing. Um, so some people were using header tanks, so pump water into a header tank and try run it that way. What I would say is, I mean, it's going to be so dependent on where you are in the country and how hard winters we've had. And the last couple of winters haven't really been too bad, but it is a key requirement, particularly if you're providing hay, that those cattle will have a need for water, even if they're on the deferred grass. So there's a real mix of things in terms of cost. One participant did say that they spent £6,800 on water infrastructure, which obviously covers them for the whole year. It's not just covering them over winter. But if we apply a 15% depreciation, that's £1,000 per year. So it's even to provide a good watering system. That's not necessarily a huge cost when it's always there available and it's allowing you to utilize your pasture more effectively throughout the summer as well.
We have I just see here we have loads of questions coming in now, which is great.
Of
But
course.
we have I'm going to try and merge three of these together. Someone's asked about the protection, I suppose, and the netting around the bales before rolling out. And I suppose I've just put words in that person's mouth. They didn't say netting. They asked what was used to sort of protect the bales beforehand. And someone else has asked there that they found challenges in the amount of moisture that their bale is taking up and the heaviness of the bale then when it gets to a period where they'd want to move it. Is there anything around that that we can help in the mitigation of that? And the third one around that area too was, did the participants did they start using more netting in protecting their bales? Just going to try see if I can get that one back up. But if oh my god, they all come in thick and fast.
And then
Um,
you lose them.
yeah, but it was around that protection side, and if
Yeah,
any,
Yeah, I mean, nobody reported specifically needing to put additional net wrap on. I mean, you can do, obviously, it puts a little bit more cost in. Um,
Mhm.
some of the participants were using bale and rollers, so that enables you just to slightly more easily do if bales are heavy. That would be a help within it. Um, but I think generally quite surprised at what people felt was the degree of waste, that they didn't really feel that it's a major issue. And to be honest, I think we've probably all put silage into ring feeders or other things and always have a little degree of waste anyway, if you're putting stuff in front of stock. So I think it's maybe not quite as bad as we think it is. I mean, we still need to see it as a cost to the business if there is that little bit of wastage, but actually, if it is improving your fertility of the field that you're bale grazing and it's saving you to be spreading manure and things like that as well, then it's not too bad. With regards to heavy bales, yeah, I wonder if the bales are really quite heavy when they come in anyway. There's such a variation in how well packed some hay bales are, but yeah, bale unroller or get a handy friend
Yeah.
coming along as well.
We
Yeah.
won't make any plugs here, but yeah,
Yeah, no.
there's definitely guys out there that make the likes of them.
There are.
Um, but yes, it is something I suppose that we have to think about when we are
Yeah.
storing. Someone's asked here about, I suppose this comes back to the animal health and welfare side of it, but shelter during these periods. And I think from the farms that were used in this study, the altitude that these cows are grazing at, and was there shelter provided, or is that something that's taken into account? But actually, I suppose it's surprising how well they can thrive in those conditions as well. It's the farms have been quite varied, haven't they?
Yeah, farms are pretty varied where they are. And I think um it yeah, you need to choose your site quite carefully, and depending on what time of year you're specifically going to be utilizing that bell grazing area as well. So um
Mhm.
that is a consideration to make sure that you do have areas that are sheltered. And as I said, not everybody was bale grazing for the full winter period. So some people, I don't, yeah, one farm in particular is much higher up on the hill. They're not putting bales out there, they're just deferred grazing it. But that only happens up until Christmas because the risk of bad weather then increases you go into January, February time. So it's just a case of being a little bit strategic about where you have it. And also, as I said, things like not back fencing may allow them access back into sheltered areas or into woods or adjacent to woods and other things. So it's just, yeah, be sensible about it the way we would with, if you're putting forage crops in and things as well. It's just making sure that you are meeting the welfare requirements within it.
Well, just as you touch on some of those cover crops and other forages that are used, someone's asked here, is bale grazing deferred grass seen as being better than grazing kale and rape, etc.? I suppose that comes down to your system again, isn't it? And
Yeah,
what suits your system and your livestock. But in general, are
yeah.
you seeing?
I don't know. I suppose I mean define better. I think obviously the college of quality of a forage crop is better,
Mhm.
um, but there's the costs. There's the cost of establishing a forage crop, and forage crops can be amazing and awesome, um, but to maximize the benefit out of them, you really need to have maximum yield off of them, and we know that with tricky weather, and although last year wasn't too bad, but previous years with really dry summers, it can be really challenging to get establishment and get really well established forage crops. Um, so the advantage of using deferred grass and bale grazing is there's a little bit more predictability, I think, in it as to how much pasture you're likely to grow by the time you need to come in, and how many bales you have to put out there. But I suppose that has to be combined with the challenge, because if you think of forage crop like fodder beet, the yield per hectare can support a lot of stock. You can put a lot of stock in a very small area, which you're still I dread to think I don't think you can physically probably put enough bales out and I think you'd probably caution against putting enough bales. You wouldn't really be able to access them to be able to hold the number of stock that you can of the real high yielding forage crops like fodder beet, etc. So it's a kind of swings and roundabouts what works for you. But I think the work that's coming out from New Zealand on it, and they're specifically looking at it because partly because of welfare issues actually, um, and yeah, just dairy cows in particular on really muddy fields. And they're looking at it from that point of view of being able to address some of the wider challenges that we can see on fodder crops, um, by using deferred grass and bale grazing, even for dairy cows as well. So I think watch that space with interest actually.
Thank you. I'll just do two more questions. One's come in about do you always need to unroll, or can you just unwrap and feed in situ? And is that something that other farms? I know that the ones in this project, a lot of them are unrolling, but again, it's not a requirement. It's again down to your site that you've selected for grazing, for where you've put your bales out. But again, it comes back maybe to that nutrient cycling side of things.
Yeah, I mean, it obviously can. Your reports back generally are that, and if you're doing that, so no, you don't have to. You can just let them have access, and some people do successfully do it. I think the challenge is making sure that there's enough space for everybody to eat. So the advantage of rolling
Mhm.
out is that, and particularly if you've got um, heifers in with older cows or the ones that are more likely to get a bit bullied, they might not actually be getting access to the hay if they're having to come into the single spot. Um, Certainly, I think some people felt they maybe wasted a little bit more than with unrolling. Again, it's just that thing that if you unroll, they all get access relatively quickly to be able to tidy it up behind it. So,
Mm.
but certainly in terms of nutrients, unrolling, and even that data comes from Canada and the US actually, in terms of avoiding nutrient hotspots, is to a recommendation is to unroll, because obviously you're spreading that manure and dung over a much wider area than if you just have the single point. Um, I think the challenge, one of the key to me, it's one of the advantage of hay though is generally you can unroll it a lot more easily. Silage becomes, a totally different kettle of fish. Um, and for that, really, and most people say you actually really need to have a ring feeder if you want to be using silage within it.
Thank you, Emily. Like I said, there's lots of questions that came in, but we'll be taking a tally of all the questions. And if there's anything in there that we haven't answered, we'll review it tomorrow and try get those answers out to you when you get that email that will have the links in it. A few questions came in there about the report. Will this be able to be watched back? The answer is yes. It will go on our YouTube channel. It will stay there. So anybody, you can share it or you can watch it back yourselves. Also, I would advise when you've had time to read the report for yourselves in more depth. Going back through this webinar will kind of help you again with where those figures came from, what was taken into consideration, and so on. That link, this will be sent to you in the next 24 hours, and there will be a link to the report there as well. If you want to access the report at any time, it is on our webpage. If you go on Google or go onto the AHDB webpage and put in economic bale grazing report, it will come up. If you have any issues, please feel free to email the Beef and Lamb team, and we can help you with that. I am just going to very quickly just wrap this up. After flagging those things, I do want to thank you all for joining us tonight and engaging in the discussion around the Bale Grazing Report. We're really excited about it, and we're really thankful to Pasture for Life and Innovative Farmers for inviting AHDB to come along and collaborate on this piece of work. The demand, the interest that we've seen from industry has been huge. This is something that's becoming a more a more common topic that's been spoken about. So we feel it is our role to kind of give that information and resources and uh, technical content to be able to support you in your decision making. So it is something we will be trying to do more on. I want to say a big thank you to Emily for sharing her expertise with us, and again to Innovative Farmers and Pasture for Life for helping us bring this webinar together tonight. Before we wrap up, though, I do want to just share this. It will be in the email that's going to be shared with you all. But I want to invite you to join us on an upcoming farm event where we'll be catching up with Jay Sordy and Sons company. Harry is one of our monitor farms. He is one of the farmers that's part of this wider project. So it's hosted alongside Ridian Jones, who was co-author of this report, and the event will be focusing on evaluating cattle systems since 2021. So he's looking at his previous system compared to his current systems now, which may sound familiar to a lot of people, everyone that joined here today. They will be exploring genetics, effective forage use, grazing planning, and how that can help reduce costs. And they'll be sharing their expertise about wintering 160 suckler cows on deferred grazing and silage bales. So again, someone asked there earlier about did anyone have silage bales rolled out? Yes, they did. So if you found tonight's webinar valuable, we're confident that you'll find this sort of on-farm, hands-on opportunity to see these strategies in action really beneficial. So please check out our events webpage and get registered. Again, thank you everyone that took part in tonight's webinar. Emily, again, thank you for your time. I hope you all enjoyed it, and it's something we'd like to do more of. But yeah, I'm going to wish you all good night now. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.